April 2nd, 1865. Jefferson Davis was sitting in his pew at church. A messenger slipped through the service and handed him a telegram. If stories like this keep American history alive for you, hit subscribe. More untold chapters every week. He read it slowly. His face went white. The Confederate defensive lines at Petersburg had broken. Richmond, the Confederate capital, would have to be evacuated. That night, Davis and his cabinet fled south, by train, into a country that was dissolving around them. Confederate soldiers set fire to their own tobacco warehouses, their own munitions depots, anything the enemy might use. The fires spread. By morning, a third of Richmond was burning, and the Confederate government's last gold reserves, just a few $100,000, rode on a single train through a country that no longer believed in the currency they were carrying. But here's what nobody was asking in that smoke-filled dawn. The war wasn't lost on a battlefield. It was lost 4 years earlier, the day the first Confederate dollar was printed, because the real story of the Civil War, the story they don't teach in most classrooms, is an economic story. The Confederate dollar lost 90% of its value in 4 years. If you were a Confederate soldier watching your pay become worthless, would you have stayed or gone home to your family? Tell me in the comments. It's the story of a nation that built the most extraordinary agricultural wealth in the world, and then discovered, too late, that cotton and forced labor cannot stop artillery shells, cannot fill empty stomachs, cannot print money that holds its value. The Confederate States of America didn't just lose a war. It was doomed before the first shot was fired. And today, we're going to show you exactly why. If you want more untold stories from America's wars, hit that subscribe button. New chapters drop every week, and you won't want to miss what's coming. To understand why the Confederate economy collapsed, you first have to understand what that economy actually was, because it was not what most people imagine. It was not backward. It was not primitive. In raw terms of wealth, the American South in 1860 was one of the richest regions on Earth. The 15 slave states produced roughly 75% of the world's cotton supply. In 1860 alone, cotton exports from the American South were valued at approximately $191 million, more than all other American exports combined. The 4 wealthiest states in the Union, measured by per capita wealth, were all Southern slave states: Mississippi, Louisiana, South Carolina, Georgia. Mississippi planters alone held more wealth than the combined bank deposits of Chicago, Cincinnati, and St. Louis. Think about that. One agricultural state in the Deep South held more financial assets than 3 of the North's fastest-growing industrial cities. So where did all that wealth come from? And why couldn't it fight a war? The Confederate economy ran on 2 things: land and enslaved labor. The plantation system was not simply a cultural institution. It was a vertically integrated economic machine. Enslaved workers cleared the land, planted the crop, harvested it, processed it, and loaded it onto riverboats. Enslaved artisans built the plantation houses. Enslaved people cooked the food, raised the children, and kept the entire machine of daily life running. By 1860, there were approximately 3.9 million enslaved people in the American South. Their combined market value, the price at which they could be bought and sold as property, was estimated at roughly $3.5 billion. That figure exceeded the total value of every factory, every railroad, and every bank in the entire United States. Enslaved human beings were the South's primary capital asset. They were collateral for loans. They were inheritance. They were, in the eyes of Southern law, property, the foundation upon which the entire economic structure rested. And that foundation created a fatal set of dependencies. The Confederate States had roughly 9,000 miles of railroad track in 1861. The Union had 22,000. But the raw mileage understates the problem. The Southern Railroad network had been built to serve one purpose: moving cotton from the interior to port cities. It connected plantations to rivers. It connected rivers to the sea. It was not built to move armies. Southern railroads used at least 8 different track gauges, meaning a train from one line frequently couldn't even run on another line's tracks. There were almost no repair facilities. Iron rails that wore out couldn't be replaced. The South had only one major ironworks capable of rolling rails, the Tredegar Iron Works in Richmond, Virginia. When the war began, Tredegar had roughly 800 workers. The Union's iron industry employed tens of thousands. The manufacturing gap was even more staggering. In 1860, the 11 states of the future Confederacy contained roughly 9% of the nation's industrial capacity. 9%. The state of Massachusetts alone manufactured more goods than the entire Confederacy. The South had no significant arms manufacturing, no significant shoe manufacturing, and this would matter enormously because armies destroy shoes at a ferocious rate. No chemical industry, no powder mills worth mentioning. A Confederate officer named Josiah Gorgas wrote in his diary in 1861 that the Confederacy was attempting to create, from almost nothing, the industrial capacity to fight a modern war. He called it a labor of Hercules. He wasn't wrong. Jefferson Davis understood the economic challenge better than almost anyone in his government. Josiah Gorgas built a war machine from almost nothing, but the Confederacy still couldn't win. What one resource do you think would have changed the outcome? Weapons, railroads, money? Drop it below. He was not a fire-breathing secessionist by temperament. He'd served as a U.S. Senator, as Secretary of War under Franklin Pierce. He knew the Union's strength from the inside. When the Confederate Congress elected him president in February 1861, Davis was at his plantation in Mississippi, pruning rose bushes. His wife Verena later wrote that when the telegram arrived, he read it slowly and his face went pale. He told her the news, the way a man tells someone about a terminal diagnosis. Davis knew. He knew the Confederacy's economic foundation was not built for the war it was about to fight, but he was president of a revolution. And revolutions don't survive on caution. Here is the deepest irony of the Confederate economic position. The thing that made the South rich, enslaved labor, was also the thing that prevented it from industrializing. Why build a factory when land and forced labor gave you everything you needed? Why invest in railroads when rivers took your cotton to market? Why develop a skilled industrial workforce when you could force people to work for nothing? The plantation economy hadn't just failed to build industrial capacity, it had actively prevented it. And now the bill was coming due. On February 9, 1861, the Confederate Congress passed its first financial legislation. The new government authorized a loan of $15 million. The problem was immediately apparent. To whom would it offer this loan? The Confederate treasury was empty. The new government had no credit history. International bankers had no reason to trust it, and the entire Southern economy ran on agricultural credit, money that existed on paper, backed by crops that hadn't been harvested yet. Christopher Memminger, a South Carolina lawyer who became the Confederacy's first and only Secretary of the Treasury, was an intelligent man placed in an impossible position. He faced a structural crisis from the very start. The Confederate Constitution constrained the government's ability to levy direct taxes. The same men who fired on Fort Sumter to protect their property rights were not going to hand that property over to Richmond. So Memminger did what governments without tax revenue have done throughout all of history. He printed money. By the end of 1861, the Confederate government had issued roughly $100 million in paper currency. By the end of 1862, $400 million. By early 1864, total Confederate currency in circulation exceeded $1 billion. And what backed all of it? The promise of a Confederate victory that was becoming less likely with every passing season. Inflation statistics from the Confederacy read like a nightmare unfolding in slow motion. In January 1861, a pound of bacon in Richmond cost about 12.5 cents. By January 1862, 25 cents. By January 1863, 75 cents. By January 1864, $1.75. By the final months of the war, A single pound of bacon cost as much as $10 in Confederate currency. A Confederate private earned $11 a month. When inflation consumed the value of his pay faster than the army could even distribute it, what was a man supposed to do? Stay in the trenches, or go home and feed his family? Many chose to go home. The Confederate desertion rate, historians estimate, reached somewhere between 100,000 and 200,000 men over the course of the war. A staggering hemorrhage from an army that could never afford those losses. In 1863, the Confederate Congress passed the tax in kind, requiring farmers to contribute 10% of their agricultural produce directly to the government. It was brutal, essentially forced requisition. A Georgia farmer named Samuel Pickens wrote in his diary that the Confederate tax collector arrived at his farm and took a fifth of his corn, 2 of his hogs, and a quantity of sweet potatoes. He wrote, "I would as soon have the Yankees here, for at least they would take from me by force of arms, and not by my own government's law." This is a point that rarely makes it into military histories. The Confederate government's own taxation policies actively alienated the rural base that provided most of its soldiers. Men who had enlisted to fight for Southern independence found their families being impoverished, not by the Union Army, but by Confederate tax collectors. Howell Cobb said it himself, "If enslaved men make good soldiers, our whole theory of slavery is wrong." The Confederacy couldn't arm the people it was fighting to keep enslaved. Was the outcome ever really in doubt? Let me know what you think. Judah P. Benjamin, the Confederacy's Secretary of State, one of the shrewdest men in Confederate service, spent years trying to secure foreign financial support. He negotiated the Erlanger Loan of 1863, a bond offering floated on the Paris market. It raised approximately $15 million for the Confederacy. $15 million. For a government burning through hundreds of millions a year. It came at a punishing interest rate. It was backed by promises of cotton deliveries that became increasingly impossible to fulfill as the blockade tightened. The Confederacy ran out of money, and then it ran out of everything else. In the spring of 1861, an old general sat in Washington and drew a plan on a map. Winfield Scott was 74 years old. He weighed over 300 pounds and couldn't mount a horse without assistance. He was a hero of the Mexican-American War and the War of 1812, and his mind, even in old age, remained one of the sharpest military minds in America. The plan Scott proposed was simple and brutal. The Union would blockade the entire Confederate coastline, roughly 3,500 miles of it, from Virginia to Texas. Simultaneously, Union forces would seize control of the Mississippi River, splitting the Confederacy in two. Cut off from trade, cut off from supplies, cut off from foreign intervention. The Confederate states would slowly suffocate. The press called it the Anaconda Plan, after the South American snake that kills its prey not with venom, but with constriction, wrapping itself tighter and tighter until its victim can no longer breathe. Lincoln's government initially dismissed it as too slow, but the Anaconda Plan went forward anyway, because it was right. On April 19, 1861, 1 week after Fort Sumter fell, Lincoln proclaimed a naval blockade of the Confederate States. The Union Navy had roughly 42 ships capable of blockade duty. The Confederate coastline had 189 harbor entrances, river mouths, and inlets. In the beginning, the blockade was so porous it was almost laughable. In 1861, roughly 9 out of every 10 ships that attempted to run the blockade succeeded. But the Union Navy was building. By 1863, over 400 ships on blockade duty. By 1864, over 600. The success rate for blockade runners dropped from 90% to 50% to, by the final year of the war, 1 in 3. And what couldn't get through was everything the Confederacy needed most: industrial machinery, copper for shell casings, saltpeter for gunpowder, medical supplies, shoes, cloth, leather. The Confederate strategy to break the blockade was not military, it was economic. Withhold cotton from Britain and France, the theory went, and those industrial nations, desperate for the raw material their textile mills required, would intervene on the Confederacy's behalf, force the blockade, recognize Confederate independence. It was a reasonable-sounding theory. It was completely wrong. In 1861, British and French textile warehouses were stuffed with cotton surpluses from the bumper crops of 1859 and 1860. The withholding of Confederate cotton caused relatively little immediate pain. By the time British mills began to genuinely suffer, by 1862 and 1863, when the Lancashire cotton famine threw hundreds of thousands of British workers into unemployment and near starvation, the strategic window had closed, and there was a deeper problem. Britain's political establishment could not openly support a nation whose entire economy was built on the enslavement of human beings. Not after Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation in January 1863, which transformed the Union war effort into an explicit crusade against slavery. The British working class, the very people suffering most from the cotton famine, overwhelmingly supported the Union. Starving Lancashire mill workers held meetings by candlelight in the winter of 1862 and voted, again and again, to oppose Confederate recognition. Abraham Lincoln sent them a letter of thanks. The British government, reading the political winds, did not intervene. The King Cotton gamble had failed, and with it went the Confederacy's last realistic hope of compensating for its economic weaknesses through foreign support. On April 8, 1861, 3 days before Fort Sumter, Josiah Gorgas resigned his commission in the United States Army and accepted an appointment in the Confederate service. He was 43 years old, a Pennsylvania-born ordnance officer. He'd married into a prominent Alabama family and cast his lot with the South. It was one of the most consequential personnel decisions in Confederate history. Not because Gorgas was a battlefield hero. He spent the entire war behind a desk in Richmond. But because the desk he sat at was the Confederate Ordnance Bureau, and what he accomplished there was, by any objective measure, extraordinary. When Gorgas took over in April 1861, the Confederacy had almost no capacity to manufacture modern weapons. Roughly 120,000 small arms of all types, many of them obsolete. Almost no artillery. Essentially no capacity to manufacture gunpowder at scale. Within 18 months, Gorgas had transformed that situation. He established new powder mills at Augusta, Georgia, among the largest in the Western Hemisphere, by importing machinery through the blockade and recruiting chemists from Europe. He created a network of arsenals across the South. He sent agents abroad to purchase weapons and machinery. He established lead-smelting operations, copper mining ventures, and niter collection programs that had Confederate citizens scraping their cellar floors and collecting urine, literally, to extract the raw material for gunpowder. Gorgas wrote in his diary on April 8, 1864, the third anniversary of his appointment, "I have succeeded beyond what I dared to hope." And it was the truth. But it was also, in a grimly ironic way, a testament to how badly everything else was going. The Confederacy could make weapons. It couldn't feed the men who carried them. The Tredegar Iron Works in Richmond was the industrial heart of the Confederacy, the primary source of Confederate heavy artillery. But Tredegar's capacity was finite, and the demands placed on it were not. By 1862, Confederate engineers were tearing up lightly used railroad tracks to melt down for cannon barrels. They were collecting lead pipes from plantation houses. In at least 2 documented cases, cemetery fences were stripped and smelted into bullets. The Confederate government was actually debating whether to tear up the rails connecting cities in order to maintain the most militarily critical lines. These were the choices the industrial gap forced upon them, not between good options and bad ones, but between slow catastrophe and fast catastrophe. Here is a detail that rarely appears in textbook accounts of the Civil War, but which reveals the depth of Confederate logistical crisis with brutal clarity. Shoes. An infantry soldier in active campaign destroys a pair of shoes in roughly 6 weeks. The Confederate Army had no significant domestic shoe manufacturing capacity. The North shoe industry, centered in Massachusetts using early mechanized production lines, was producing millions of pairs per year by 1862. The Confederacy was stitching shoes by hand and still couldn't keep pace. Confederate soldiers at Antietam in September 1862 were fighting barefoot. not because of supply failures alone, but because there were no shoes to supply. Lee's army lost men to exhaustion and foot injury during the Maryland campaign, not from enemy action, but from the simple absence of footwear. Stonewall Jackson's legendary foot cavalry, the troops famous for their speed of march, left bloody footprints on Virginia and Pennsylvania roads. The side that could make shoes won a logistical battle that never made it into any tactical history. Here's a question worth sitting with. If you were Josiah Gorgas and you could requisition one thing the Confederacy desperately lacked, weapons, iron, shoes, food, or foreign recognition, what would it be? Drop your answer in the comments. It began, as these things often do, with women. On the morning of April 2nd, 1863, a group of several hundred women gathered in Capitol Square in Richmond, Virginia. They had come from the working-class neighborhoods of the city, the families of Confederate soldiers, seamstresses, laundresses, factory workers. Many of them were carrying axes. The women marched down Main Street toward the commercial district. They smashed shop windows. They seized bread and meat and flour. They moved through Richmond's business district in a wave of controlled fury. And by the time Governor John Letcher appeared to read them the Riot Act, the crowd had grown to over 1,000 people. Jefferson Davis himself came to address them. He stood on a wagon. He spoke about Confederate patriotism, about shared sacrifice, and when the crowd did not disperse, he reached into his pocket, threw what money he had into the street, and told them the militia would fire on them if they did not leave within 5 minutes. They left, and the Confederate government moved immediately to suppress news of the riot. Newspapers were asked not to report it. The Richmond bread riot of April 2nd, 1863, did not appear in most Confederate newspapers at all. But it happened, and it revealed something the Confederate leadership could not suppress with censorship. The home front was breaking. The man most responsible for Confederate military supply was Lucius B. Northrop, the Commissary General of the Confederate Army. He was Jefferson Davis's friend from West Point, and Davis protected him long past any reasonable point, because Northrop was, by almost universal consensus among Confederate commanders, catastrophically inadequate for his role. Robert E. Lee wrote to Davis about Northrop, repeatedly. Beauregard despised him. Longstreet called his supply failures a form of slow murder. Northrop responded to criticism by blaming the railroads, or the farmers, or the blockade, anyone and anything except his own management failures. In the winter of 1862 to 1863, Confederate soldiers in Virginia received what their official rations allowed, roughly 4 ounces of meat per day. In practice, often less. Confederate railroads began deteriorating from the war's first days, not from enemy destruction, from maintenance failure. Southern railroads had been built using British-manufactured iron rails and American-manufactured locomotive parts. Once the blockade cut off imports, replacement parts became nearly impossible to obtain. Locomotives that broke down were cannibalized for parts. Rails that wore out couldn't be replaced. By 1863, a journey that might have taken 2 days in 1861 took 4 or 5 days, if the trains ran at all. Perishable food spoiled in transit. Ammunition sat in depots while soldiers went without it. At Chickamauga, in September 1863, Confederate soldiers won a significant tactical victory, and then couldn't pursue the retreating Union Army because they lacked the supplies to sustain an advance. A victory that couldn't be exploited. An economy that produced it couldn't sustain it. The letters Confederate soldiers sent home tell this story more clearly than any official report. A Mississippi soldier named Thomas Warwick wrote to his wife in January 1864, "I am well, but I am hungry. We have had no meat for 8 days. I do not know how long I can stand it. Martha, if I was home, I could eat a whole hog myself." A Georgia private wrote to his mother in March 1864, "Mother, the men are leaving every night. I do not blame them. They have families. I have you. I will stay as long as I can." Confederate desertion accelerated through 1863 and 1864, not primarily because men feared death, but because they knew their families were suffering. The impressment of food, the collapse of Confederate currency, the rising prices that made even available food unaffordable. These things drove men out of the army and back to their farms, as surely as any enemy fire. The South's armies were starving their way to defeat, long before Grant's campaigns in 1864 and 1865 dealt the final military blows. If this story is reshaping how you see the Civil War, a like helps others discover these stories. It means more than you might think. By the winter of 1864 to 1865, the Confederate States of America existed on paper, and in the memories of the men still fighting for it. The reality was different. In Richmond, the Confederate dollar had fallen so far that a single gold dollar was worth approximately 60 Confederate paper dollars. A barrel of flour cost 1,500 Confederate dollars. A simple dress cost $800. Government clerks maintained kitchen gardens in their backyards because their salaries couldn't feed their own families. The Confederate Congress was still meeting. Jefferson Davis was still issuing proclamations. But the fuel that ran it all, money, food, manufactured goods, the faith of the Southern people, had nearly run out. In January 1865, Robert E. Lee sent a letter to the Confederate Congress that stunned Richmond. He recommended, carefully, reluctantly, but unmistakably, that the Confederacy consider arming enslaved men and offering them their freedom in exchange for military service. The proposal was not new. General Patrick Cleburne had raised it in January 1864 and been ordered to silence by Davis's government. Cleburne died at the Battle of Franklin in November 1864. His proposal buried with him. But Lee's proposal could not be buried, and what followed was one of the most revealing debates in Confederate history. The opposition didn't rest on military grounds. It rested on the foundational argument of the Confederacy itself. If you armed enslaved men and freed them for service, what exactly were you fighting for? Howell Cobb of Georgia, former U.S. Secretary of the Treasury, one of the Confederacy's most prominent figures, put it with terrible clarity. He wrote, "If slaves will make good soldiers, our whole theory of slavery is wrong." Cobb was right, and the Confederacy couldn't escape that logic. The thing it was fighting to protect was the thing that prevented it from fighting effectively. The Confederate Congress did eventually pass a bill in March 1865, allowing for the enlistment of enslaved men. It offered no guarantee of freedom. It came too late to matter. Lee surrendered at Appomattox 3 weeks later. On the evening of April 2, 1865, Jefferson Davis sat in his pew at St. Paul's Church in Richmond when a messenger handed him a telegram. Lee's lines at Petersburg had broken. Richmond would have to be evacuated. Davis fled south by train into a Confederacy dissolving around him. Confederate soldiers set fire to the tobacco warehouses, the munitions depots. The fires spread. By morning, a third of Richmond was burning, and the Confederate government's last gold reserves, a few $100,000, rode on a single train through a country that no longer believed in the currency they were carrying. The arithmetic was complete. The Confederate economy had produced, over 4 years of war, hundreds of thousands of dead, the physical destruction of much of the Confederate South, hyperinflation that wiped out the savings of an entire region, and the collapse of the very plantation system that had generated its wealth. It had not produced victory. It had never had the capacity to produce victory. In the years after the war, Southern writers and politicians constructed what became known as the Lost Cause mythology, a narrative attributing Confederate defeat to overwhelming Union numbers and material superiority. There is a grain of truth in the material argument. The Union did have enormous advantages, but the Lost Cause narrative carefully avoided the deeper question. Why did the South lack those advantages in the first place? The answer, which the mythology could not accommodate, was slavery. The plantation economy that created the South's wealth also stunted its industrial development, concentrated power in a small planter aristocracy, prevented the formation of a diversified labor market, and created a financial system built on human beings as collateral rather than productive capital. The Confederacy didn't lose because the Union was too strong. It lost because the Confederacy was built on a foundation catastrophically unsuited for modern industrial warfare. And that foundation was the deliberate, systematic exploitation of millions of human beings. Josiah Gorgas survived the war. He became president of the University of Alabama. He kept his diary for the rest of his life. And in 1878, he wrote what may be the clearest economic epitaph in American history. He wrote, "We were defeated by what we were, as much as by what they were." The physical scars of the Confederate economy's collapse took generations to heal. The former Confederate states remained the poorest region of the United States for 100 years after the war's end. Per capita income in the South didn't reach national averages until the mid-20th century. Approximately 650,000 to 750,000 soldiers died in the Civil War. 4 million people were enslaved in the Confederate States at the war's beginning. Their emancipation was the war's most consequential outcome, and also its most incomplete one. The economic and legal structures that replaced chattel slavery, sharecropping, convict leasing, black codes, Jim Crow, extended the exploitation of black labor for another century. The Confederate economy didn't just lose a war, it left behind a legacy of poverty, racial injustice, and stunted development that the American South spent generations trying to escape. James Henry Hammond, the senator who declared that cotton was king, died in 1864. 1 year before the Confederacy that built its entire strategy on his words, surrendered. He died believing the cause might still prevail. He would have been wrong, even if he'd lived to see the end, because the Confederacy's defeat wasn't a close call that went the wrong way. It was the inevitable result of an economy optimized for one purpose, extracting agricultural wealth through coerced labor, and then asked to do something for which it was entirely unsuited. Fight a modern industrial war against an opponent with 20 times its manufacturing capacity, a functioning central bank, a robust rail network, and an ideological narrative that, after January 1863, had the moral high ground. Cotton was not king, it was a crop. And 4 years of war proved that crops don't win wars. Factories do, railroads do, money that holds its value does. Soldiers who are fed and shod and paid do. The Confederacy had none of those things in sufficient quantity, and no amount of courage on the battlefield, and there was real courage on both sides, in quantities that should humble anyone who studies this war, could compensate for the structural failures of an economy that had been telling itself comfortable lies for decades. The bill when it came was paid in blood.